who are on the whole um, enthusiasts for European unity, inspired by Christian teaching. So we're very conscious that there are many Christians who are not so inspired in the United Kingdom. And therefore, many of the issues raised by our first speaker this afternoon raise really important challenges for us that it would be very good for us to address in a forum of this kind. My name is Ashley Beck, by the way. I'm the moderator of Faith in Europe. And it's good to see so many of you this afternoon, and people are still coming in. It's a great pleasure to welcome Hans Kundnani as our first speaker this afternoon. Hans is an associate fellow and former Europe Programme Director of Chatham House, very important research centre in this country. He's just begun to be a visiting scholar at the Remark Institute at New York University. So Hans is joining us from New York. And this is the book that prompted me to think of this afternoon's session, Eurowhiteness, that came out last year. There was an article about it, I think, in New Statesman, which gave it some prominence. So Hans, we're very grateful to you for joining us this afternoon, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Could I ask people to mute themselves, make sure they're muted when they're not speaking? But Hans, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon from New York. And I'm very much looking forward to this discussion because, as Ashley said, the book came out last August. And so I spent the sort of second half of last year talking about it a lot. But most of the talks that I've given about the book have been at universities and a couple of book festivals and things like that. But this is the first time that I'm talking to a sort of church-related gathering, as it were. And so I think this could be an interesting, slightly different discussion from the ones I've had about the book so far. And Ashley sort of already said that I guess my argument might sort of challenge some of your assumptions about the European Union. I'm also sort of looking forward to you sort of challenging me about my challenge, as it were. So I'll try to talk for sort of 30 rather than 40 minutes. I always find with these discussions that the most interesting part of it is the sort of interaction after the initial sort of opening remarks. Having said that, there's quite a lot in the book. It covers quite a lot of ground. And so I will try to sort of give an overview of the argument that I make, which is mainly about the European Union itself, and Europe and ideas of Europe, and then I have a last chapter on Brexit, and so I'll say a little bit about that as well. Before I sort of get going with the overall sort of argument of the book, maybe I should just make two sort of as a sort of preface, two sort of remarks about myself and the perspective, I suppose, that I'm writing the book from, so that you know where I'm sort of coming from. So I guess so the first thing I should say is that I'm British, but I have two parents who are immigrants to the UK. My father was Indian, and my mother is Dutch. And so that kind of combination of sort of having been born in London and grew up in London, but then, as I say, having these two parents from different places, I think sort of is the perspective, or perspectives plural perhaps, from which I sort of approach a lot of these questions around Europe. And the reason I say that is because I think, first of all, I think I think you're mostly British, so I guess in that sense we're all coming from the same perspective, which I think is a sort of kind of semi-detached. Britain has this notoriously semi-detached relationship with Europe, and I've worked on Germany a lot. My two previous books were about Germany, and it's always struck me that so much of how we all think about Europe and what Europe means does really depend on where you're coming from. And as I say, I've worked on Germany a lot, and I think Europe just looks very, very different if you're in the middle of Europe, and always have been, as Germany is. There's this famous term, the Mittellage, which is the sort of central position in Europe that Germany has always had. I think that gives you a very different perspective on Europe than you have if you're sort of on the periphery, as Britain is, on the sort of northwest periphery of the UK. And I do think that sort of geography does sort of influence a lot of the different ways that British people and German people, as I say, just to take two examples, think about Europe. So that's the first thing, is the sort of British perspective, which, maybe I don't need to spell this out to you, but when I talk to Europeans, continental Europeans, I always think that's worth spelling out. But then the second thing that makes it complicated is, as I mentioned, I have these two parents who are immigrants, and so I have, as I say, my mother's Dutch, which means that I think I always slightly felt probably a bit more European than a lot of British people who only have two British parents might feel. I think that gave me a sort of an additional connection with the idea of Europe than a lot of British people had. But then on the other hand, my father's Indian, in other words, a country outside of Europe that was colonized by Britain. And so that combination of those two parents, I think, always gave me a sort of sense of being European, as I say, perhaps even more than some Brits, but that was also that I could never think of myself as being fully European. In other words, I sort of feel European, but only partially European. I start the book in this way because, as I said before, I want to sort of be transparent about the sort of subjective position from which I'm thinking about all of these questions to do with Europe. So that's the first sort of preliminary remark. The second is that in terms of my career, so I was a journalist a long time ago, and then for around the last sort of 10, 15 years, I've been basically working in European foreign policy think tanks. And in particular, I started working at a think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations in 2009. And that's a think tank which at the time had its head office in London, but also had offices in 6 other European capitals. It's very much a sort of pro-European foreign policy think tank that aimed to help the European Union develop a more coherent, effective foreign policy. And at the time when I started working there in 2009, I thought of myself as being a pro-European, although in retrospect, I thought I understood the European Union, but actually in retrospect, I didn't. And it's really only since I started working there and learned more about it that I think I sort of started to really understand its history and its kind of its evolution. And the short story of that is that the more I did understand the European Union, the more I learned about it, the more Eurosceptic I became. Over a process of about the last 10, 15 years. And coinciding with that period that I started working there, this was roughly from the sort of the beginning of the Euro crisis in 2010 onwards. And so I also sort of had the impression, as well as me sort of learning more about the European Union and starting to become more Eurosceptic the more I learned about it, there was also this way in which I think the European Union was changing against the background of its response to the Euro crisis and then the series of other crises that followed on from that. And so, as part of the process of writing the book, frankly, was me trying to sort of disentangle in my own head how much of my sort of increasing Euroscepticism was about, as I say, just a sort of subjective process of me learning more about the European Union, and how much of it was about the European Union objectively changing, in real time, as it were. As I say, the arguments that I'll make, you can decide for yourself, how much of that, accurately captures the reality of how the European Union has changed, and how much that is just my own subjective perceptions of the EU, as it were. Okay, so that's the sort of, as I say, just the sort of background to the book, as it were. It's basically a book about ideas of Europe, the history of ideas of Europe, and what the post-1945 integration project, what became the European Union, what it has to do with this longer history of ideas of Europe, and how we should sort of understand the European Union in the context of that longer history. In particular, I make this. I guess I'll start by saying that Ashley at the beginning used this term European nationalism. In the first chapter of the book, I developed this concept of regionalism, which I tried to suggest is somewhat analogous to nationalism, except on a larger continental scale. And that, I think already you can see sort of challenges the idea that the way that a lot of pro-Europeans, and by the way, I'll use that term quite a bit, pro-Europeans, and what I mean by that is basically supporters of European integration in its current form. It's a complicated question because it's evolved over time, but I roughly mean supporters of the process of European integration as it's developed. And the way that a lot of pro-Europeans want to think about the European Union is as an expression of something like cosmopolitanism. And I discuss in the book, some of the theoretical attempts to frame it that way, in particular, some German thinkers like Jürgen Habermas and Ulrich Beck. And I try to suggest that that's a misleading way of thinking about the European Union. And to give you one very sort of concrete example of that, when you say I'm a European citizen, or just I'm a European, you're not saying, just logically, I'm a citizen of the world. That's not what it means. Theresa May, you may remember at the Conservative Party conference shortly after Brexit, had this line about how if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And the implication of that, because this was in the context of the Brexit discussion, was that to think of yourself as being a citizen of Europe was to say I'm a citizen of the world. I just think that's wrong. When you say you're a citizen of Europe, a European citizen, or just a European, you're not saying I'm a citizen of the world. You're saying I'm a citizen of this very particular region called Europe, which has a very particular history and a relationship with the rest of the world. There is, I think, a tendency among pro-Europeans to almost mistake Europe for the world, to think that they're talking about the world when they're really only talking about Europe. And I think this is an example of that. So I think that a much more helpful way to think about European identity and about the European Union is, as I say, as an expression of regionalism, which is something like nationalism. It's analogous to nationalism, except on a larger continental scale. And that, I think, is a helpful way to sort of conceptually frame Europe and the European Union and European identity for multiple reasons, but mainly because what it allows us to do is to take a whole series of intellectual resources that we have from the study of nationalism and to think about whether we can apply those to Europe. So just to give you one example, Benedict Anderson famously talked about nations as imagined communities. Well, I would suggest that we can think about Europe as being an imagined community in a very similar kind of way. And there are lots of implications of that, which we can get into in the discussion if you're interested. The main sort of theoretical kind of distinction that I use in the book is this distinction between a sort of ethnic nationalism on the one hand and a civic nationalism on the other hand, which I then apply to regionalism, right? So we can think in terms of an ethnic or cultural regionalism and a civic regionalism. Now, this is a distinction which goes back to a study called The Idea of Nationalism, written in 1944 by Hans Kundnani, a German-American academic. And as I say, he distinguishes between an ethnic nationalism and a civic nationalism. And he, I think, does it in a somewhat simplistic way. He tries to sort of suggest that there are some nationalisms that are purely civic, and here he's thinking particularly of American nationalism. And then there are some that are purely ethnic, and he's thinking here particularly of German nationalism. I think we have to use this conceptual distinction in a much more subtle way, so that, if you think about the history of any individual nationalism, whether it's American or German or any other. It has a mixture of ethnic and civic elements that interact in kind of complex ways. I think you could take any nationalism and show that the history of each of them has these different elements that interact in this kind of way. And I'm basically suggesting that, you know, we can apply the same distinction to, in the case of regionalism, to the European Union. So there have been throughout the history of ideas of Europe, on the one hand, these ethnic cultural elements, and on the other hand, these civic elements, and they've interacted in some complex ways, and I try to show in the book how they do that. One more footnote on that before I move on is that I use this term ethnic/cultural as opposed to just straightforwardly ethnic, which is how Hans Kundnani talks about it. And I think that's important because, and this is relevant to something we might discuss, which is that if you think about the history of these ideas, these ethnic ideas of, you know, in the case of nations or in the case of Europe, they're never strictly about race. There's this kind of very kind of blurred distinction, it seems to me, in European history between ethnicity and culture and also religion. This is the bit that, as I say, might be relevant to the discussion we're going to have. Those two things kind of tend to blur into each other quite a lot. There's also a particular phenomenon since 1945. You know, there's a lot of academic work on this, which suggests that, you know, as the concept of biological race became somewhat discredited after 1945, a lot of racism has tended to shift to a kind of cultural racism, what has sometimes been called neo-racism. And, you know, but I think also if you go back much further in history, often, you know, before the 19th century, a lot of racism wasn't strictly about race in the biological sense. It was always culture as well. So, you know, that's I can say more about that if you want to challenge me on that or discuss that further. But my premise is that, you know, actually ethnicity and culture and religion tend to be very blurred, at least in the history of Europe. Okay, so as I say, I talk about this, you know, I frame this in terms of regionalism, and I'm trying to, in the book, think about how the ethnic/cultural elements of European identity have interacted with the civic ones. So the story I tell begins, you know, essentially in medieval Europe. In the period of classical antiquity, you have the first idea of Europe as a space, and obviously this is where the name Europe comes from, is from Greek myth. But European as an identity doesn't really exist during classical antiquity. It's really only in the medieval period that you start to get the first version of an idea of European identity. The first reference that we seem to have to the idea of people as Europeans is in something called the Mozarabic Chronicle, which some of you may be familiar with, from the 8th century, which is this account in Latin of the conflict between the Franks, in other words, the forerunners of today's French, and Arab forces. It's an account of the Battle of Poitiers, or the Battle of Tours, as it's known in France. And the first time that, as I say, we have this reference to Europeans, it's the Franks that are referred to as Europeans, and they're specifically contrasted with the Arabs. And so that kind of contrast, or that othering, is there from the beginning, and I would suggest is quite integral to the idea of what it means to be European, is to not be Muslim. And more broadly, throughout the medieval period, to the extent that this idea of Europeanness as an identity exists, it is largely synonymous with Christianity. The two terms tend to get used interchangeably. And, you know, I'm compressing a very sort of long, much more complex history here, which we can get into in more detail in the discussion if you're interested. But I think roughly what happens is that the idea of Europe starts to sort of usurp, as one of the studies of this puts it, the idea of Christianity. They're sort of used interchangeably, but over time, what starts to happen is that European tends to get used more and Christian tends to get used less as the power of the church during the medieval period declines. And, but as I say, the key point to emphasize here is that during, the entire medieval period, what it means to be, the space called Europe is largely synonymous with Christendom, and what it means to be European is largely synonymous with being Christian. And the embodiment of that medieval idea of Europeanness, which is synonymous with Christianity, is the figure of Charlemagne, who then becomes the embodiment or the inspiration for the post-1945 European project. And I'll come back to that later on. But I think you can already see from that the way that this sort of Christian element of European identity doesn't disappear. It sort of remains there even in the post-1945 period. Having said that, what then starts to happen is that in the modern period, in other words, roughly from about 1450 onwards, you start to get a new, much more complex idea of European identity, which emerges in the context of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And so it's a much more secular, rationalist idea of Europe as opposed to a religious one. But it's important to emphasize that it's also emerging in the context of the encounter of Europeans with the populations of Africa and Asia, and in particular the Americas. In other words, the context in which the idea of whiteness starts to emerge. So as well as being a sort of rationalist idea of Europe as opposed to a religious one, it's also a racialized idea of Europe as opposed to a religious one. And so there's this way in which in the modern idea of Europe, it becomes more about whiteness than about Christianity, even though, as I sort of suggested a minute ago, the idea of Christianity is sort of there and still there in the background. And so then the question becomes, and this is basically the question that the book tries to answer, is, well, what happens after 1945? Do these older ethnic cultural ideas of Europe, connected to Christianity, connected to whiteness, simply disappear, which is what a lot of pro-Europeans want to think, that there's this sort of hour zero in 1945, that a completely new idea of European identity emerges that has nothing to do with these older ideas, these older ethnic cultural ideas. I think if you look at the history, it's much messier than this. There's much more continuity between the pre-1945 period and the post-1945 period, as I've already suggested, by referring to the figure of Charlemagne, who becomes this this inspirational figure for the post-war integration project. So what I then try to do in the remainder of the book is to sort of describe the evolution of the EU in basically three phases. The sort of periodization I have is that there are three phases of the European project. The first phase is roughly the period from 1945 until the end of the Cold War. And the first thing to say about that period is that it's important to emphasize that what we think of as what became the European Union, European integration, begins as a colonial project. A lot of pro-Europeans want to imagine that it's a kind of a post-colonial project, but that's just historically, in chronological terms, wrong, in the sense that European integration doesn't begin after decolonization; it overlaps with the last period of European colonialism. But it's more than that. It's not just that it intersects historically, but that part of the point of European integration in that early phase in the 1950s was for France and Belgium to consolidate, to integrate, if you like, their remaining colonies in Western Central Africa. It's quite extraordinary. If you look at a map of the territory covered by the Treaty of Rome in 1957, most of it is not in Europe at all. It's in Africa. as I say, France and Belgium still had these vast colonial possessions in Western Central Africa, which they were no longer able to maintain on their own. In particular, what they needed was an injection of West German capital. And this is part of what's going on at the beginning of this project. There's this fantastic book called Eurafrica by P.O. Hansen and Stefan Jonsson, which came out a decade ago. It's one of the books that it totally transformed my understanding of the early phase of European integration. It's one of the things that led to me writing this book, was the kind of the sort of thought process that began with reading this book. And it shows, as I say, definitively based, developing earlier scholarship on this as well. That, as I say, this is part of the objective of European integration in the 1950s. So, in my book, I call this the original sin of European integration. Consciously analogizing to the role of slavery in the founding of the United States. Now, having said that, that colonial project very quickly comes to an end because, by basically about 1960, most of these Belgian and French colonies in Western Central Africa have become independent. So as a sort of formal colonial project, it's come to an end by 1960. There's still a very big open question, I think, about the extent to which, since then, there's something neo-colonial about the European Union, particularly if you look at EU-Africa policy, and we can come back to that in the discussion. But as I say, as a formal colonial project, it's come to an end by 1960. And so what I think then happens is, in that context, is that there is a sort of new civic idea of Europe that starts to emerge, particularly centered around what becomes the social market economy and the welfare state, and also the sort of depoliticized mode of governance, this sort of technocratic approach to governance that European integration itself produces. So there's a sort of new civic identity that emerges, really only among elites, to be fair, but nevertheless, there is this kind of new civic identity that emerges. However, something else is happening during that same period, which is that the sort of way in which the EU imagines itself is starting to evolve as well. And in particular, the way that the Holocaust starts to become integrated into the sort of story that the EU, or what becomes the EU, tells about itself. At exactly the same time as this memory of European colonialism and the role of the early phase of European integration in it is being forgotten. And so, and so this story that I mentioned a minute ago about the colonial origins of the EU is completely sort of written out of the official narrative of European integration, which becomes all about this sort of peace project idea. And the story of the Holocaust, or the memory of the Holocaust, becomes integrated into that peace project narrative. And you can see how it fits quite neatly into that story of the peace project, precisely because the Holocaust takes place in the context of World War II. So you can fit it quite neatly into this much bigger, longer story of, centuries of conflict between Europeans, going back to conflict between Catholics and Protestants, and then national conflicts, particularly between France and Germany, all culminating in World War II and the Holocaust. The story that that pro-Europeans tell about the EU is that the European integration was meant to overcome that. And so the way I describe it in the book is that the story of the EU becomes based on these internal lessons of European history. In other words, what Europeans did to each other, but it sort of excludes what you might call the external lessons of European history. In other words, what Europeans did to the rest of the world, and in particular European colonialism, which becomes, completely forgotten. And my argument in the book is that this isn't just a coincidence that this happens, that there's also something structural going on here, which is that European integration, it seems to me, encourages European countries to think of European history in terms of their relations with each other, rather than their relations with the rest of the world. So you get this kind of this narrative of European history as a kind of a closed system, right? This entirely self-contained history that goes from classical antiquity through, you know, the Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment, and then, as I say, these centuries of conflict, and then ultimately the two world wars and the Holocaust. And in particular, there's sort of interactions between Europe and the rest of the world, especially Africa and the Middle East, which, you know, throughout history, going all the way back to the medieval period, have had these really complex interactions with Europe, is kind of written out of the story. And so my argument is that the EU becomes a kind of a vehicle for imperial amnesia. Timothy Snyder, the historian, talks about the way in which, after the end of World War II, European integration provides European countries with a kind of soft landing after empire, as he puts it. But it's a soft landing in which it's kind of an escapism. It's a soft landing that allows them to sort of forget about empire, rather than engaging with that history and thinking about some of the implications of it for the present. So that's the, you know, as I say, my sort of description of the sort of first phase of European integration from 1945 to the end of the Cold War. The second phase is roughly the 20-year period after the end of the Cold War. And what I think happens during that period is that the EU, as it then becomes with the Maastricht Treaty in 1992, goes into this kind of quite expansive and optimistic mode. This is, you know, the time in which you have enlargement of the EU to include Central and Eastern European countries, the so-called Big Bang enlargement in the 2000s. And in that context, pro-Europeans start to almost imagine that they can remake the whole of the world in the image of the EU. So I mentioned at the beginning that I worked at this European foreign policy think tank called the European Council on Foreign Relations. And the director, Mark Leonard, my boss at the time, wrote a book in the mid-2000s which captures this kind of moment perfectly. And it was called Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. You know, as I say, this idea that you can almost remake the world in the image of the EU. There are at least two problems with this, it seems to me. The first is that it sort of led to a revival of the old idea of a European civilizing mission. That isn't a concept which I've mentioned so far, but it's one of the long continuities in this story of ideas of Europe. You know, I think the way I put it at one point in the book is to say that, you know, almost as long as Europeans have thought about themselves as Europeans, they've thought of themselves as being superior to the rest of the world. There's a kind of long history of this kind of European superiority complex. And in particular, this idea of a set of universal values, which are European in origin, but universal in terms of their applicability, which, you know, then leads you to this idea of a civilizing mission. Now, as I said, you know, in the medieval period, it's you know, the idea of Europe is very much synonymous with Christianity, and so the European mission at that time is a religious mission, right? It's about converting people. What then happens in the modern period, as you get this more secular idea of Europe, is something that we recognize is, you know, much more familiar in terms of how we think about this idea of a mission civilisatrice, a civilizing mission, obviously in the context of European colonialism and so on. And my argument is that doesn't just go away after 1945, but there's a kind of a new version of this civilizing mission that you get in the context of European Union. It's a kind of postmodern or sort of technocratic civilizing mission. But I think it's very difficult to not think about it as, you know, a sort of updated version of that longer history of a European civilizing mission. And again, here, you know, as in, you know, many elements of the book, I'm drawing on a lot of academic work. So there's a Polish academic, Jan Zielonka, who was at St. Antony's in Oxford for a long time, who wrote about precisely this, the idea of the EU's new civilizing missions in Central and Eastern Europe in the context of enlargement. There's also this idea which emerges around that time of, different theories around the EU as a kind of an actor in international politics. There's this idea of the EU as a civilian power or as a normative power. And again, all of these theories kind of, again, it's quite difficult, I think, not to see them in terms of this history of a civilizing mission, because what they're really about is this idea that the EU is civilizing international politics itself. That's the first problem, is the revival of the European civilizing mission. The second is that even as the EU's borders to the east become softer in the context of enlargement, the EU's borders to the south remain hard. So in 1987, for example, so in other words, before the end of the Cold War, Morocco applies to join what is then the EC and is just told flatly that you can't because you're not a European state. And so, whether you think that is right or not, the point is that I think what happens is that as the borders to the east start to soften and the borders to the south remain hard, it strengthens, I think, this idea that the EU is basically a white bloc, that it's a bloc which is only open to countries that are white and Christian as well. So that's the second phase from the 20-year period after the end of the Cold War. And then the final phase, which basically is from 2010 to the present day, and this is going to bring me to some of the issues which I think Liam is going to develop more. You have what I call the civilizational turn in the European project. I mentioned at the beginning that I started to work at ECFR and started to think more about the EU in the context of this series of crises in the European Union that began in 2010 with the Euro crisis. And I think that brings to a rather abrupt end this expansive, outward-looking period that I mentioned a minute ago. And suddenly the EU goes into a much more defensive mode after the Euro crisis, and then the series of other crises that follow on from that. In 2011, you have the Arab Spring. Then, you start to have a more aggressive Russia. In 2014, you have the annexation of Crimea, and so on. And in that context, the EU starts to go into this kind of defensive mode, and it starts to see itself as being surrounded by threats. And so one of the consequences of that is this language around protection, around protecting Europeans, starts to become much more central to the sort of discourse in the EU. And then the second turning point, I think perhaps an even more critical juncture, is the refugee crisis in 2015. And my argument in the book is that what happens after that is that the EU starts to see these threats to it in civilizational terms. This is against the background of the rise of the far right throughout Europe during the last decade or so. But almost as importantly as the rise of the far right itself, it's the way that the center right, in particular Christian Democrat parties, are increasingly mimicking the rhetoric and the policies of the far right, especially on these questions around identity and immigration and Islam. And where you see this, most clearly, it is in migration policy, where you've had since 2015 this increasingly brutal approach by the EU. Again, I think Liam will talk more about this, but I'll just say that 28,000 people now have died in the Mediterranean, crossing the Mediterranean since 2014. This is the most deadly border in the world. And this is largely as a result of EU policy. So you see it very clearly in the brutality of the EU's migration policy. Human Rights Watch last year had a report which said you can summarize EU policy in the Mediterranean in 3 words, which are "let them die." But it's not just the brutality of the policy; it's also the way that it's framed. So, to give you one example of that, in the current European Commission, the Ursula von der Leyen Commission, which began in 2019, there's a new position of European Commissioner for promoting the European way of life, whose job is in part to keep migrants out. I mean migrants from the south here, right? Not from the east, not Ukrainian refugees, but non-white, non-Christian refugees from the south. And that makes very explicit, I think, that the EU thinks of migration not just as a difficult policy problem to be managed, which obviously it is, but as a threat to the European way of life. In other words, it sees it in civilizational terms. And here again, to circle back to something I said earlier on, that phrase, the European way of life, in an earlier iteration of the European project, that phrase was used, for example, by French socialists to refer to things like the social market economy and the welfare state and the principle of solidarity that those things were meant to embody. Now it's framed much in a that term is used in a very different way, and it's much more civilizational. So migration policy is where you see this most clearly. You also, though, I think are starting to see it in European foreign policy debates. This was the space that I used to work in, where international politics is increasingly being framed by people like Emmanuel Macron as a clash of civilizations, and one in which, unlike Samuel Huntington, who wrote the famous book The Clash of Civilizations in the 1990s, he saw the West as one civilization. So he was predicting conflict between the West on the one hand and Islam and China on the other hand. There's a sort of European version of that civilizationalism, which is slightly different, which sees Europe as a distinct civilization, distinct also from the United States. And that's very much the way that Macron talks about it. So the conclusion, or the question really with which I end the book, or at least the part of the book that's about the EU itself, is whether these ethnic cultural ideas of Europe, connected to whiteness, connected to Christianity, that go all the way back to this much longer history of ideas of Europe, whether these ethnic cultural ideas of Europe are not getting weaker, but now actually starting to get stronger again. And it's those ethnic cultural ideas of Europe connected to Christianity, connected to whiteness, that I call Eurowhiteness, hence the title of the book. I think I'm going to stop there for now. I mentioned at the beginning that the last chapter of the book is about Brexit and about some of the implications for this. I can talk more about that in the discussion if you're interested, but I think I've already slightly overrun. So let me stop there so that we have a little bit of time for discussion. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Hans. For the discussion, could I ask people to put their hand up through the Zoom system and not sort of simply shout? There are about 26 of us here, so I'll try and make sure I can see any hands that come up. But thank you very much. That was very, very, very challenging and compelling in many ways. So questions or comments?
Hi. Yeah, no, just I was under the impression that it would then be Liam responding and then questions would follow. Is that correct?
Yes, questions now. Yeah.
Questions now.
Questions or comments now. Yes.
Yeah, cool. No, I thought that was really interesting. I'll not to bring it straight into the Brexit conversation, but it's interesting that the response to the Brexit is that was a nationalist approach, and then you've got the regionalist approach, and that's where I kind of feel most comfortable going. I'm European and not English. But then I think you raised some really interesting points that is still othering. There's another border in there. There's still another othering. What would you say is kind of the correct response, not the correct response? What would your response would be to Brexiteers, if you like, to those who are arguing against Brexit from a regionalist point of view, if that makes sense? If you're going to touch on that, I'm sure you've touched on that in the book, and I probably need to buy it and read it. But I thought I would like to kind of start the conversation on that.
Thank you, Hans.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jake, for sort of prompting me to add the something on the last chapter, which I didn't have time to do. And first of all, thank you also for mentioning the point about borders, because I think that's another really, it sort of makes quite concrete what I was saying about regionalism, because, you know, pro-Europeans want to think that what the EU is about is de-bordering, right? In other words, abolishing borders. And this is a perfect example of mistaking Europe for the world, right? There is a tendency to think that Europe is against, you know, the EU is against borders. No, it's not against borders. It's just, you know, it's rebordering rather than debordering, right? It's moving borders from one place to another, right? You know, there was a time, you know, earlier on, sort of 20 years ago, in that optimistic outward looking phase that I was talking about, when I think it was still possible to imagine that by removing borders within Europe, you know, through the creation of the Schengen border-free zone, it was a sort of building block or a precursor to a completely borderless world, right? That you remove borders internally within Europe first, and then, as I say, you remake the whole of the world in the image of the EU, and then there are no borders. But I think it's subsequently become clear, not least since the refugee crisis, this is again why I think this is such a crucial, critical juncture, that the flip side of having no borders within the EU means that you have to have a hard external border, right? And as I say, that sort of illustrates the way that the EU is not just about, it's not debordering, it's rebordering. And to circle back again to where I started in terms of different perspectives, you know, British and German perspectives, you know, I think this is, it's very clear, you know, when you look at the debate in Germany, they're really, I think, they tend to believe precisely in this idea that we're abandoning borders completely. But what I think from a different perspective, you can see very clearly that all that's happened from a German perspective is that borders have been moved further away from Germany, right? So now that, you know, Germany is able to sort of outsource the control of its borders to, you know, countries on the periphery of the EU and beyond. Again, this is something that Liam might want to talk more about, the sort of way in which border management has been outsourced to authoritarian states in countries like Turkey and, you know, Libya, and most recently Tunisia. But from a German perspective, this looks like, well, we don't have any borders anymore. Because, you know, Germany's bang at the center of Europe, as I mentioned. Okay, now Brexit. So I guess maybe I'll start again by sort of by making this quite personal. You know, so I mentioned at the beginning, you know, my father was Indian, my mother's Dutch, and they both came to Britain in the 1960s. And at that time, it was much easier for someone like my father, an Indian citizen, to move to Britain than it was for someone like my mum from the Netherlands, right? And he also had way more rights than she did when he first arrived in Britain in the 1960s. He could vote from day one. He could do everything that a British citizen could as an Indian citizen. You know, this is to do with the legacy of the Commonwealth. My mum wasn't able to at all. In fact, she had to report to a police station as an alien for a very long time, right? And more broadly, you know, there's a way in which he, as an Indian man, was much less of an outsider in British society than she was as a Dutch woman with blonde hair and blue eyes. Now, he experienced some racism in Britain in the 1960s and 1970s, but as I say, he was much less lonely, by the way, than she was. He was much less of an outsider. What's then happened in my lifetime is that position, that balance, as it were, between Europeans on the one hand and non-Europeans, in particular Commonwealth citizens on the other hand, has been completely rebalanced. It's become easier and easier for Europeans to come to Britain and harder for non-Europeans, particularly Commonwealth citizens, to come to Britain. So one example of that is during the Blair era, when you have the enlargement to include Central and Eastern European countries, and the Blair government decides that Britain becomes one of the three countries in the EU to not have temporary restrictions on immigration from Central and Eastern European countries like Poland. At that very same moment, the Blair government is introducing visas for Jamaicans to come to visit Britain. Not to come settle here, but even to come visit, they now need a visa. And these are people who historically, as I mentioned, had an absolute right to come and live in Britain, and they weren't immigrants at all. They were actually citizens, right? So my father and that whole Windrush generation came to Britain not as immigrants, but as citizens. right? They were moving from one part of the British Empire to another. But they weren't immigrants at all. We've retrospectively reimagined them as immigrants. So, as I say, it's become easier and easier for Europeans to come to Britain, harder and harder for non-Europeans, as we've gone through this process, you know, from the 1970s onwards, of thinking ourselves as the UK as being part of a European community, right? Now, that then leads to this situation, very interesting in the context of the Brexit referendum, where you have a lot of non-white people in Britain, by the way, a third of whom voted to leave, who felt as if freedom of movement was a kind of discrimination against them. Because anyone from, say, Bulgaria could come to Britain tomorrow, people with no connection with Britain, whereas Caribbean people, South Asian people felt, I can't bring my own family members over, right? And as I say, there's a sort of historical injustice to this, not just because of the responsibility and the debt of gratitude that I think Britain owes to its former colonies, but also because of the historical way in which these people were citizens. And so my argument in the book is to say, look, is there not something which is a kind of an opportunity here for Britain with Brexit to sort of, and by the way, I think this is actually happening to some extent, to sort of partially reverse that change that's happened in my lifetime, and to think of ourselves not necessarily as being exclusively part of this European community, but to think of ourselves as being part of a different set of, a different community of fate, if you like. Perhaps, a community of fate that includes Britain's former colonies. So I basically argue that it's an opportunity for Britain to engage more deeply with its colonial history. Also, this follows on from the argument I made earlier on about this way in which the EU is a kind of a vehicle for imperial amnesia, right? It encourages Europeans to think about their histories in relation to each other. So surely there's an opportunity in Brexit for Britain to deepen its engagement with its colonial history, deepen its relationship with its former colonies, and to think perhaps about a project of reparations. These debates are just sort of beginning now. Is there not a way in which Brexit is a kind of an opportunity for Britain to become a less Eurocentric country?
Thank you. In the absence of any other hands going up, I wonder if I could ask something myself. I mean, much of what you say is compelling as well as challenging, and I'm speaking from the south of England and not the north of England, where I realise some perspectives during Brexit were different. But do you not think that part of the drive behind Brexit, the rhetoric, the way in which some of the campaign was run, not to mention the current policies of the majority party in Parliament, were and are as hostile to migrants from Asia, Africa, as they were from Europe, that the anti-migrant side of the Brexit campaign was not simply directed at people from Europe. It was a wider agenda that we're still suffering from, particularly this very week. And how would you respond to that?
Yeah, it's a great question, challenge, Ashley. Thank you for that. So yes, I mean, to some extent, I agree. So I think the problem is basically that Brexit was so complicated. There's so much going on in Brexit, and what is 17.4 million people voted to leave. There's probably 17.4 million reasons for voting to leave. It's very difficult to generalize about the motivations of leave voters. And then on top of that, you have to distinguish between, on the one hand, what political scientists would call the sort of political entrepreneurs, right? The politicians themselves, people like Nigel Farage, what they're saying on the one hand, and what voters are thinking and their motivations on the other. These are not necessarily the same thing, right? And one very simple example of that, which I think illustrates this point, is there were left-wing leavers too, right? And I should perhaps have said this at the beginning. To the extent that I'm Eurosceptic, it's a left-wing Euroscepticism, which is very different from a right-wing Euroscepticism, of the kind, of Nigel Farage. So it's very, very difficult to generalize about what was going on during the Brexit referendum. I do accept, Ashley, that some of the political entrepreneurs like Farage, and some of the voters were sort of essentially motivated by racism. I'm not denying that. I don't think it was the decisive factor. As I say, it's so complex, right? There are a lot of concerns around democracy, around sovereignty, all kinds of things. There's so many different motivations going on that it becomes very difficult. It's so elusive, I think, Brexit. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, you mentioned, what's happened post-Brexit. That also is complicated. The current, and as I say this as somebody on the left who's not at all supportive of this government. But, there are two things going on at once, with the current Conservative government in relation to questions around immigration. On the one hand, you have this, frankly, I think, insane rhetoric and policy, for example, the Rwanda scheme and so on, around refugees, which is deeply, I oppose it. And, that's where I sort of fully agree with you, Ashley. But even this Conservative government is doing something else at the same time, which is if you look at legal migration routes as opposed to refugee policy, there has been some of the rebalancing that I'm talking about. In other words, away from Europe and towards the rest of the world, and in particular towards Britain's former colonies. So if you look at the legal immigration figures since Brexit, and as I say, this is with a Conservative government, it's quite extraordinary because it hasn't led to an overall drop in immigration at all. It's led to a massive increase in immigration, Brexit. So if it was the case that, some of the campaigners for Brexit or some of the voters, people that voted Leave, if what they were motivated by was trying to stop immigration, this is not happened, right? Quite the opposite. Immigration has increased. Now, within that, though, it's really interesting because there has been a massive drop in European immigration, a massive increase in non-European immigration, in particular from Britain's former colonies, from these countries that historically people came to Britain from above all India. I mean, the numbers for Indian immigrants is just extraordinary. And I personally, I'm in New York now, but until a couple of days ago, I was in London. And I really feel it in London. I mean, when I walk around London, you just hear Indian accents all the time. In other words, these are not second, third, fourth generation immigrants, like me. These are first generation immigrants, new Indians, also Nigerians. The numbers for Nigerians are going through the roof as well. And so, even with a Conservative government, there has been some of the rebalancing that I'm talking about and an overall increase in immigration. Now, my argument in the book is, from a left perspective, is to say, well, I'd like to go further. Given that, from my perspective at least, Britain has a debt of gratitude that it owes to its former colonies because they helped to build this country. My argument is that should be reflected in our immigration policy. It should be easier, to put it very simply, it should be easier for somebody from Trinidad to come to Britain than somebody from Bulgaria, for moral, historical reasons. And so I sort of suggest we should sort of almost go further and sort of almost codify that principle. And I call this, post-imperial preference. The idea that, we should make it easier for people from Britain's former colonies to come and live in Britain. And, you might almost, think of this as part of a project of reparations.
Thank you. I've got Evert, Heath, and then Grace. Evert van der Hol, you're mute. Evert, you're still mute.
Okay. Thank you for your presentation, which is very similar to the book I published 2 years ago, Christian Faith and the Idea of Europe and the Making of Europe. Perhaps could we bring back the discussion to Europe? I feel that we are already in the last round of Brexit, and as a non-British participant, I'm assisting to an internal British debate, whereas you presented something which is not at all limited to Britain. First of all, when you talk about pro-Europeans, I have a feeling that this term should be qualified, because there are so many ways to be pro-European. And the way you describe the arguments of pro-Europeans, it seems to me that you have in mind the Eurocrats who run the EU at the moment and their associates in the different countries. And they have a very economic bias to the European project. But I like your scheme that the European project has gone through different phases, and I agree with that. And in the first phase, as I understand it, being pro-European in the first phase was not at all about building borders around Europe, but it was about reconciliation between nations that had put themselves to death almost. And you have to realize the state Europe was in 1945 to realize the complete chaos, and people were starving from death. It was a horrible time. And at that time, pro-European was simply a matter of reconciling enemies that, if they didn't reconcile, they would go on fighting each other to death. And so I don't think that saving the colonies was the prime motivation for the founding fathers. I don't find that in any historical study. On the contrary, I missed a bit the input of Christian democratic and Christian social thinking among the founding fathers, because most of them were from a Christian democratic background. And that part has been underestimated. And if you study the values that have been put into the treaties of Europe, all these values, they come straight away from Christian democratic thinking. And it is in the second phase, in my opinion, that the European project was looking for an identity. You have the famous conference of Copenhagen, the summit of Copenhagen, where the project of the European cultural identity was launched. And then they started to look for a story for Europe, because if you don't have a story, like any nation without a story, you can't build a nation without a story. So then they were looking for roots and for a common history. And that is, I think, where your argument comes in, and I agree with that. But then we're in a later phase. I don't think that I could agree with accusing the founding fathers already of creating a sort of myth of Europe. The whole project of the European identity and the European soul by Jacques Delors is of a later date. And then the third phase, I agree with you that the third phase we're in now, there's the whole new problem that was not envisaged at all. If you look at the early documents and the early treaties, immigration was not an issue. It was not an issue. In fact, in the second phase, European countries looked for migrants to come in and to build up the economy, because we had a lack of manpower. And only in the third phase is immigration becoming a predominant theme, and the reaction to that is what we are witnessing now. And the whole thing of Frontex, the European border protection, I think that is typical of the third phase. But if we distinguish these phases, I think that could help us to distinguish also different ways of being pro-European as time went on. Perhaps you would like to comment on that. So what I'm doing is using your three phases and finding out what it meant to be pro-European in each phase.
Thank you. Before I ask Hans to reply, could I ask for Keith and Grace to make their points, and then perhaps Hans could deal with 3 points together. Keith.
Yes, thank you. I follow on from what Everett was just saying. It seems to me that if you apply your neo-colonialist analysis to Europe, that certainly, I think, works quite well in terms of immigration policy and the way in which Europe deals with refugees. However, I would want to comment particularly on what you called, I think, colonial amnesia.
Yeah.
in relation to the transition from the first phase to your second phase, because certainly during the time that I was in Brussels from 1990 to 2002, there was still an emphasis on partnership with African, Caribbean and Pacific countries. And although it had many imperfections in the way in which it worked and the policies which emerged from it, it did still nevertheless recognize a European responsibility for the future of the former British, French, and Belgian colonies, and sought to work on an equal basis with them in the development of policies. So I would want to, and that leads me to question whether the fact of the political arrangements of Belgium and France were so critical in the first phase, where for me, the whole question of Europe as a peace project is vital.
Thank you. And Grace Davey.
Thank you so much for your paper. I enjoyed it a lot. I will read your book. I just have two rather different points to make. As I listen to you, and I try to listen carefully, I kind of got, as you went through your various stages and phases and underlined the different pressures that emerged in each, I wanted to ask you whether, whichever way your thrust is towards the global perspective or towards the European perspective, I think there are benign and less benign versions of each, rather than one being good and one being bad. And I just would like to hear you develop. I don't think it's so much that one is better than the other, but they're both present, sometimes in tension, and can be handled more or less constructively. That's one point. The second point is this notion of fearing the South, fearing the other, and Europe being Christian rather than Muslim. I take your point. The trouble is, Christianity is now headquartered, if you like, in the global South, not in Europe. And I think that might be a kind of nuance on your last phase, or something worth thinking about in terms of your last phase. I mean, Europe, I think, suffers from a problem of becoming increasingly secular and increasingly religiously diverse at the same time, because the secular erodes our ability to talk well about religion. Increasing diversity demands that we do this. And I think what happens is we do it very badly. And I'd be just interested in your comments on that. I think rather than the South, sadly, I would put my focus on Islam rather than the whole South.
Thank you. Hans, would you like
and I think there are very specific reasons for that, but perhaps that's not for today.
Thank you very much, Grace. Hans, would you like to respond to those 3 points? I'm sorry, it's rather a lot to throw at you.
No, well, these are the 3 really great questions, and I'm conscious though that I'm already eating into Liam's time. So let me try to sort of, I mean, there's so much that I could say about each of these 3 questions, but I'll try to be relatively brief. So first of all, Eva, so thank you for your comments as well in the chat. It sounds like you're Dutch from your name. Am I guessing correctly?
I also have a Dutch mother.
Okay. Yeah. So we have something in common there. So yeah, maybe this is a conversation we should have separately at some point. But I guess so. you're absolutely right to, and I should have said more in my talk about that phase in the early phase of European integration in the 1950s and the role of Christian Democrats in it, because I absolutely agree with you. I make this point in the book. This is a Christian Democrat project, right, in the 1950s. And when you think about Adenauer and Schuman and De Gasperi and so on, these are all Christian Democrats. I think I slightly disagree with your interpretation of their role in it. I think it's more problematic than you're suggesting. So I guess very briefly, and as I say, maybe this is a conversation we can sort of continue elsewhere, but look, you're absolutely right that it's framed in terms of reconciliation, and the Schuman Declaration in the 1950s, in 1950, is the sort of embodiment of this, right? But I think you have to put that in a bigger context. When the Schuman when the Schuman Declaration is made in 1950, France is fighting. He's the French foreign minister, and France is fighting a brutal colonial war in Indochina. 1957, when the Treaty of Rome is signed, France is fighting a brutal colonial war in Algeria. And so I think what becomes very clear is that Europeans didn't, reject the idea of war after 1945. They just rejected the idea of war with each other. And part of the idea, and they were quite happy to continue to fight colonial wars, until they were defeated or exhausted. And then I think when you look at the sort of longer history, going back to the 1920s, and the pan-European movement, out of which, the pan-European movement in the 1920s is the inspiration for the post-war integration project. All the ideas that are then implemented, in the 1950s, from the 1950s onwards, already there in the 1920s. And if you look at that period, and I talk about this in the book, it becomes very clear what the relationship is between the peace project and the reconciliation idea and this wider colonial story. They're very much linked. And the thinking, and by the way, the key figure here is Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi, the key figure in the pan-European movement in the 1920s, who then becomes in 1950 the first recipient of the Charlemagne Prize. I talked about Charlemagne earlier on, has this inspirational figure, right? The Charlemagne Prize, the most prestigious prize for pro-Europeans, awarded in his name to this day. And the first recipient of it was Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi. And for him, and then for the founding fathers that you talked about in the 1950s, it's very clear how these two things fit together, which is part of the reason for the need for reconciliation between France and Germany and between Europeans more broadly, is precisely because it's this nationalism and this war between Europeans that is diverting them from their destiny to rule over the rest of mankind. Right? This is the way that they talk about it. It's very clear. Now, you said, Evert, quite correctly, I don't see any of this in the historical studies. And you're right, that's because it's been written out of the story, right? This is why this book that I mentioned, Eurafrica, is so crucial, because it starts to bring it back in. And you start to realize when you read it, that so much of what we've been told about the history of European integration, including, within European studies and so on, has deliberately distorted this story. It's idealized it precisely in order to create the narrative that you were talking about. And so I think that begins not just even in the 1950s, it begins in the 1920s. And the basic idea, which continues to this day, is this idea that Europe is declining. And if we want to reverse this decline in relation to the rest of the world, we have to unify. We have to stop fighting each other. We have to unify. And so I think it's very clear that the European project was always not just about peace. It was always about power as well. That's my argument in the book, as I say, drawing on previous work like the Eurafrica story. As I say, maybe it's a longer conversation that we can have another time. And then quickly, Keith. I think, again, I slightly disagree with your characterization in this case of EU development policy. And again, there's a lot of really interesting academic work on this, which shows the continuities between these earlier ideas like Eurafrica, which were very much a colonial project, and what then becomes EU development policy. In particular, there's an important book by someone called Véronique Dimier, and the book title is literally, it's called Recycling Empire. And she shows how it's French colonial officials who begin what becomes EU development policy. And so I think you used the phrase, you know, it was about a European in the later, the period you were in Brussels in the 1990s, there was a responsibility towards the global south, towards former colonies, and a sense of working with these countries as equals. I'm not sure that I agree with that. I think it was that's precisely the neo-colonial accusation at the EU. A lot of it focuses precisely on development policy in Africa and elsewhere. And so the idea is that there's this kind of long tail, if you like, of European colonialism precisely in EU development policy. And then Grace, again, great questions, and we need much longer, but very quickly on your first one, I think my basic attempt to differentiate between benign and non-benign versions of European identity is precisely this distinction between ethnic, cultural, and civic. You know, my argument is basically that the civic is a benign, whether it's nationalism or whether it's regionalism. So whether we're talking about British identity or European identity, it seems to me that a civic identity is a benign one and an ethnic cultural one is a non-benign one. That's basically my my argument to the book. Sorry, I've just spilt some water here. Give me 1 second. And then the last point, Grace, on Christianity in the global south, that's a really interesting point and a much longer conversation. I think all I would say is that the role, there's the way I think of this, and again, this is based on the work of some other academics. There's been what has been called a sort of culturalization of Christianity. So it's not really about, you know, particular theological beliefs, but what happens is, and this goes back to what I said at the beginning about the blurring of these distinctions between ethnicity and culture and religion, Christian becomes a kind of a cultural identity rather than a particular religious or theological position. And this, I think, is also why, if you look at, say, the far right in, you know, Western European countries like the Netherlands and France, which, you know, hate Muslims not because they're not Christian, but because they're not secular or perceived to be not secular. And then the far right in Central and Eastern European countries, places like Poland and Hungary, which precisely does hate Muslims because they're not Christian, it ends up amounting to the same thing, because in countries like France and the Netherlands, you know, as I say, there's been this sort of, well, sorry, in the Central and Eastern European countries, there's been this sort of culturalization of Christianity, where it ends up being a kind of a cultural category that is quite closely connected to whiteness rather than a sort of religious or theological category. But as I say, it's a much longer conversation. We need much more time.
Thank you very much. And we're very grateful to you, Hans, but I want to move straight on to Liam for his presentation. Liam is a senior research officer for the Jesuit Refugee Service in the UK. He formerly worked as a researcher at the Catholic Bishops' Conference of England and Wales. Liam, welcome, and over to you.
Thanks, Ashley. And just to give a bit of context for those who aren't familiar with JRS, so we're part of a global body with a mission to accompany, serve, and advocate for refugees and other forcibly displaced people across the world, working in 50 different countries. So I'm working here with JRS UK, and JRS works in 23 countries across Europe, both EU and non-EU countries. And Father Ashley asked me to offer a few thoughts today, specifically concerning the situation facing refugees who are seeking sanctuary in Europe. So I'm not going to comment on the theme as a whole, but to throw in some thoughts from a faith and NGO perspective that might hopefully add something to the discussion, and got a slightly shorter offering, but that may nevertheless stimulate some thoughts today. So I want to first touch on, as you might imagine, coming from the Jesuit Refugee Service, touch on what Pope Francis has had to say about the situation facing refugees arriving in Europe. then go on to say a little bit specifically about the EU Pact on Migration and Asylum that Hans sort of introduced in his talk, and then finally want to bring it back to what's the relevance for us in the UK. I know most of the participants and churches here are based in the UK, so to really link it back to what that means for us. So to start off, from Pope Francis's point of view, it's been almost a decade since the Pope's historic visit to Lampedusa, which was really the point where he put care for refugees at the very heart of his pontificate. And before that visit, around 8,000 people had arrived on the island that year, and at least 500 had died trying to reach it. And when he visited, when he celebrated Mass there, the Pope said, "How many of us, myself included, have lost our bearings?" He said, "We're no longer attentive to the world in which we live. We don't care. We don't protect what God created for everyone. And we end up unable to even care for one another. And when humanity as a whole loses its bearings, it results in tragedies like the one we have witnessed." So referring to that loss of life of people trying to reach Lampedusa. And of course, those numbers, the context he was speaking in then, and each one of those representing a person with a name, a face, and a story, have been surpassed many times since then. And Pope Francis has frequently returned his attention to the situation on Europe's borders. He's spoken about the fanaticism of indifference, about the terrible lack of humanity, and referring to the Mediterranean as a vast cemetery. So Hans touched there around the 28,000 plus people who've died in the Mediterranean since 2014, and really worth, I think, pausing and thinking about just what that figure means. Each one of them a person like you or me. And towards the end of last year, Pope Francis spoke directly to European leaders, and he reminded them that those who risk their lives at sea do not invade, they look for welcome, they look for life. And he actually challenged this concept of what we often talk about a migration crisis or a migration emergency. And he rejected that framing of it and said that as for the emergency, that the phenomenon of migration is not so much a short-term urgency, always good for fueling alarmist propaganda, but it's a reality of our time. And that it's a process that involves 3 continents around the Mediterranean, and that must be governed with wise foresight, including a European response capable of coping with objective difficulties. So firstly, he's rejecting this idea of a crisis or an emergency. He's saying that this is a reality in which we live, something for Europe to address, but also for its wider neighbourhood. So he's calling for a continental response, firstly, and that's something he's consistently done. He said that the European Union can't leave Cyprus and Greece and Italy and Spain on the borders with all of the responsibility for people who arrive on their shores. But he's also calling for an intercontinental response, recognizing that Europe can't be and shouldn't be isolated from its wider neighborhood. And this is something that Pope Francis also picked up earlier this month when he was talking to ambassadors at the Vatican about the new EU Pact on Migration and Asylum. And just before I go into some of the details of the pact, just want to quote a bit from what he said to ambassadors on that occasion. He said that no country should be left alone, nor can any country think of addressing the issue in isolation through more restrictive and repressive legislation, adopted at times under pressure of fear or in pursuit of electoral consensus. He said, in this regard, I welcome the commitment of the European Union to seek a common solution through the adoption of the new pact, while at the same time noting its limitations, especially concerning the right to seek asylum and the dangers of arbitrary detention. So it's important here that he's encouraging the principle of a joint European response to refugees, even if he's very critical of how it's being undertaken. So for those who aren't familiar, some background to the pact, just as a top line, it's a package of common policies for EU member states on migration and asylum that was proposed by the European Commission President back in 2020. And it really came about from a widespread feeling at the time that the old system wasn't working and needed significant overhaul. And after 3 years of negotiations, the political agreement and the key issues were concluded at the end of last year, at the end of 2023. And the first part of 2024 is being spent on the technical negotiations and the formal adoption of the pact. Now, for those of us who are concerned with the rights of refugees, that has been enormously disappointing, to say the very least. So there are massive concerns with a whole range of areas, things like screening and border procedures that will actually increase the use of immigration detention, weak mechanisms for monitoring human rights abuses, and designated so-called safe third countries. And this follows a trend that's seen those controversial EU deals with Turkey, with Tunisia, with Libya. But perhaps most significantly, while there's a lot of talk about solidarity, the pact still leaves most responsibility with states on Europe's borders. So other states may end up making financial contributions to them under the pact, but they're not required to play their part in actually welcoming people who are fleeing to Europe. So unsurprisingly, JRS, Jesuit Refugee Service, has been fiercely critical of this. And our colleagues in Europe have called for European legislators to reject the pact. Our Europe director, Father Alberto, actually described this as a historic low for the common European asylum system, and explained that it sets up a system that will likely concentrate thousands of people, including children, in de facto detention at the EU's borders. This pact will not only fail in solving the current system's shortcomings, but it will exponentially increase people's suffering and the obstacles they have to face to reach protection. And he said that instead, energy and efforts should go to strengthening reception and asylum systems on the ground and mechanisms for meaningful responsibility sharing between member states. So to actually really take on board that concept of solidarity, rather than just these very superficial policies that will actually increase the suffering of those trying to reach Europe for safety and for a better life. And this message was reaffirmed at the JRS Europe regional coordination at the end of last year. So this was a collective message from across the continent that said that many of the issues that are important to us, things like the ban on child detention, the exclusion of vulnerable people from screening procedures, the provision of free legal assistance, none of these have been sufficiently addressed. And in addition, what's happening now in Europe is that new and worrying concepts are being added to the discussion. And this includes things like derogating from regular asylum procedures in cases where migrants are instrumentalized by countries outside the EU. So when large numbers of people are forced across the EU's borders, that the same sort of regulations and procedures that will apply for others won't be applying in those cases. And really crucially, this statement from JRS Europe concluded that overall, the proposed measures provide a breeding ground for anti-migrant and xenophobic sentiments across the continent. So like the Pope, JRS is supportive of collaborative EU efforts in this area, but it's the content of the pact that's the problem. The EU needs to recheck its moral compass, and reform of the asylum and migration policy needs to be guarded by those EU values of human dignity, solidarity, and liberty. They need to be put back at the heart of it. Father Alberto said the EU was created to tear down walls at our borders. I know that's something that's been discussed today, but to tear them down, not to build them higher. And if the EU chooses to continue with this pact, JRS will remain at the side of forcibly displaced people, will continue to serve and accompany them, and to advocate for a common European asylum system that is worthy of the name. So given that we're in this context, but given that we're an island nation and almost 7 years on from the Brexit referendum, I think it's worth asking the question of what does the EU's migration and asylum policy mean for us? Why does it remain relevant? From our context, we're working with JRS UK as part of JRS Europe, so working with colleagues across the continent from within and outside the EU. But I think there's real relevance to this for the wider society as a whole, to our churches, to people concerned with the rights of migrants and refugees. Firstly, that's because we're looking at so many of the same issues. That message from JRS Europe I mentioned earlier said that by pushing forward to force an agreement at all costs, the EU is losing its moral compass, and that efforts should instead be directed to expand legal pathways to protection, invest in dignified reception systems, and sharing the responsibility to protect people. And you could easily apply those words to the UK today. And, looking at the debates that took place in Parliament last night, the legislation that's being passed right now, we're seeing a systematic dismantling of the asylum system. We're seeing the potential for the rollout of mass detention when already so many people are held in appalling detention conditions in the UK. And we're seeing attempts to remove people to unsafe countries in violation of their human rights, all the while safe routes are being shut down. So the historic low for the common European asylum system is being mirrored by a historic low on this side of the Channel. Similarly, the warning that EU measures will provide a breeding ground for anti-migrant and xenophobic sentiments is also very applicable to our own policies and our own politics, the hostile rhetoric that we're seeing from our own politicians and the media here in the UK. And secondly, given our geography, you simply cannot separate out what is happening in the UK from what is happening in the rest of Europe. A couple of years ago, the Catholic bishops of England and Wales produced a paper outlining some of their hopes for the UK's future relationship with Europe after Brexit. And unsurprisingly, one of the issues they focused on was how we respond to refugees. They said at the time that the number of people making perilous journeys across the Channel has rapidly increased. And while these figures are comparatively small compared to other borders of the EU, such as the Mediterranean, each one represents a human being made in the image of God. Yet the frequency of people losing their lives is also increasing. And tragically, of course, we witnessed that again towards the end of last week. And they went on to talk about cooperation between the UK and its EU neighbours. They spoke about how cooperation between the UK and France in response to this has focused almost exclusively on fortifying the border, on UK investment in law enforcement, technology, security infrastructure across northern France, intelligence sharing, and proposals for joint sea patrols aimed at stopping the boats. And they talked about the tensions where the UK was proposing to forcibly turn people back in a move that the UNHCR had warned can endanger lives and break international law. And the bishops called for cooperation to take a different format. They talked about how cooperation between the church in the UK and mainland Europe has, instead of focusing on border security, emphasised the sanctity of human life. And they said that the governments of the UK and France need to work together to assist those struggling, recognising that they're dealing with people who have already escaped persecution and danger in their own countries. So they called for facilities that would allow people to raise their asylum claims from mainland Europe, for safe and legal channels, and for infrastructure to enable dignified living, citing the humanitarian situation in northern France. And they also referenced a joint call from Catholic and Anglican bishops on both sides of the Channel urging their own communities to create a climate of welcome and understanding for strangers who share in the hopes and needs of all humanity. So there's this real emphasis on a need for positive cooperation between the UK and the EU. And this was also referenced by the European Bishops' Conference in their own response to the pact when it was first being developed. They talked about how particular attention should be paid to the humanitarian situation on the EU's external borders, including the English Channel, and talked about the high number of people making perilous and often deadly journeys, both to reach Europe, but also within Europe towards the UK. And again, this reference that Pope Francis has made about the need to avoid these shores becoming vast cemeteries. So for those two reasons, the fact that we're seeing so many of the same political developments on this side of the Channel, and the need for cooperation between the UK and the EU in response to those people who are fleeing war, poverty, and persecution to find safety. What's happening in Europe, the EU Pact and the responses to it have a direct relevance to all of us here in the UK, faith groups, NGOs, individuals who are concerned with the human rights of refugees. In this rather bleak context, it can often be hard to find hope. And I think that's where our churches and organisations come in. At a conference in the Vatican in 2017 called Rethinking Europe, which served as the inspiration for that paper from the English and Welsh bishops that I talked about, Pope Francis called for us to put the human person back at the centre of all we do. He called for it to be back at the centre of the European project and everything associated with it. So I just want to conclude my short remarks by proposing that we have a responsibility to encourage real solidarity in response to this, cooperation with people and with their fundamental rights at its heart. And I think Father Alberto, who I mentioned earlier, JRS's European director, summarised it perfectly in his Christmas message. He said, share your hope wherever you are to encourage, console, comfort, and revive. Open the future, inspire possibilities, generate alternatives, help to think and act differently. Take care of your daily relationship with God and be workers of charity and sowers of hope. We remain committed to our mission to keeping hope alive for all refugees and displaced people in Europe. And together, I'm hopeful that we can continue to make a positive impact on the lives of those who've been forced to flee their homes. Thank you.
Many thanks, Liam. Any questions or comments? We have about 20 minutes now until we finish. One of the rules of this organisation is that we do finish on the dot of 4 o'clock, I think. So please raise your hand in the usual way for any questions or comments to Liam. Christabel, you're mute.
I'm reminded, thinking about the crossing of the Mediterranean Sea and the points that were made by the previous speaker about the hard border of the south of Europe towards people coming in. I'm reminded again by the second speaker, thinking of the Mediterranean as a graveyard. It takes me back to thinking about the Roman Empire and the fact that there you had a continual process of, I was going to say, of fighting peoples who were on the edge of what they saw as the current edge of the empire, both in Europe, but also obviously in Africa, but folding the peoples in. And in the Roman Empire, the Africa, the territories, what I would, in the areas that I suppose we would think of as North Africa now, that was just as much a part of Rome as at some point they tried to make Britain, and that there was that there really wasn't ethnic, that there was ethnic diversity. It just wasn't thought about, that people of all ethnicities and indeed of all faiths or beliefs were sort of taken in, rolled in. I mean, it wasn't that it worked for everybody, but that the idea of a watertight border simply was not part of the thinking in those days. And well, it's just a point that occurs to me now, that the our approach to Northern Africa is a million miles away from that now.
Thank you. Hans, you were going to say something.
Well, I can if there's no other questions. I had a couple of thoughts, but I'm happy to defer to others. I've spoken too much already. I
can't see any other hands, so go ahead.
Well, actually, funnily enough, Christabel, I mean, I loved your point about the Roman Empire. I think it's worth just maybe saying, I mean, because the concept of race is a sort of it's a creation of the modern era. So it just simply they didn't think in racial terms in the time of the Roman Empire. I mean, it's even before the period, the medieval period that I was, with which I began my story. So the concept of race just doesn't exist in the time of the Roman Empire in the same way as it does now. And your comment made me in turn think of, I don't know if you've read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which obviously is one of the sort of classic kind of, books on European colonialism, Belgian colonialism in particular, since we're speaking of the EU. And there's this wonderful line at the beginning of Heart of Darkness where, they're sitting in the boat in the Thames estuary, and the narrator is beginning to tell the story. And he says, "This too was once one of the dark places of the earth." And what he's referring to is precisely what you just mentioned. When the Romans came to Britain, they would have seen Brits in a somewhat analogous way to the way that the Belgians or Europeans were looking at Africa. In other words, this is one of the sort of benighted, uncivilized places, right, that we're going to civilize as the imperial.
Exactly. Yeah. And they only put up a border when they found the Picts or the Scots too difficult to manage, and they created Hadrian's Wall.
Well, but I guess it is, it is also worth saying, there was famously the limes in the Roman Empire, right? I mean, it had a wall around it, and as you say, Hadrian's Wall is a good example of that. But I wanted to come back to something that Liam said. So I guess because I absolutely agree with you, Liam, that and I touched on this in my remarks as well, that in some ways the British government is doing the same thing, right? The refugee policy, looks relatively similar to the EU's refugee policy. I think that's right. I wanted to introduce that caveat about what the current government in the UK is doing on legal migration, which is a different story. But on migration, I guess one other sort of maybe helpful prism to think about this through is this kind of contrast between, the East and the South, as I described, applied specifically to refugee policy, right? Because I think one of the things to me that's been so shocking about EU refugee policy in the last few years, especially, has been the extraordinary generosity shown towards Ukrainian refugees, in contrast to the brutal policy towards refugees from the South. For example, the way that Germany, which, in 2015 in the refugee crisis then, was one of the more generous countries towards Afghans and Syrians. Nevertheless, receiving 1 million of those refugees in 2015, 2016 prompted a massive crisis in Germany, which, by the way, has completely changed the political landscape in Germany with the emergence of the AfD. Meanwhile, in the last year and a half or 2 years now since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Germany has accepted 1.1 million Ukrainian refugees, in other words, almost the same amount as in 2015, 2016, with absolutely no problems at all and no sense of a crisis. And so it's become completely clear that this is something which is totally feasible for European countries to manage. And the crisis in that sense is an imagined one that has to do with the sort of provenance and the identity of these people, rather than to do with, the logistical challenge of managing migration at all. And here, I guess Poland would be the most extreme example, or the Central and Eastern European countries in general, that have been extremely generous towards Ukrainians and extremely harsh towards non-white, non-Christian refugees, to the point of people like Robert Fico, the current president of Slovakia, saying, I will not take a single Muslim, right? But they're taking, hundreds of thousands of Poles. Ukrainians. And here I have to say, to come back to Britain, it does strike me that sort of contrast seems to me to be not as crass in the British case as in the EU case. But you may disagree with that, Liam.
I mean, I think the problem in the British case is that where there are routes available to come here, they're just phenomenally limited to specific groups. So we've seen Homes for Ukraine. We've seen a fairly successful visa route for people coming from Hong Kong, which not as refugees strictly, but a visa route for people coming as a response to the situation there. Very limited route from Afghanistan, but the problem here is that it is those specific groups which people who are very much in need of protection and deserving of our protection, but actually the fact that again in the UK we're seeing the case where if you're fleeing war violence in a very specific number of cases, that it's somewhat easier to arrive here than people who are fleeing the same sort of crises in many other parts of the world. So actually I do think here as well there is that problem where actually what we need to be working towards is a fair asylum system that actually, regardless of background, you're able to come here, have a fair hearing, because people have many different reasons for where they seek sanctuary, where they're going, why they're leaving their homes in the first place. And like both in Europe and in the EU, but in the UK as well, we're seeing just far too limited opportunities to do that, and such hostility. And I think actually that hostility to people coming, the rhetoric we're seeing in the UK is so similar to many parts of Europe and other parts of the world.
Thank you. Any other points, questions? Yes, I mean, symbolism is important. It's interesting how some people in this country, for whom until recently any flag other than the Union Jack was something more or less forbidden in their cultural universe, suddenly the Ukrainian flag becomes an acceptable handmaid, if you like, to the Union Jack. It's really very, very, very strange. Never, of course, the EU flag. Jake.
Hi. For reference, I also work. I work for the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales as well, and it strikes me there's something that kind of crosses both JRS's work, Jesuit Refugees' work, and the analysis that's been made by Hans, which was in the Love the Stranger. It's a document that the bishops released last year on kind of teachings about migrants and refugees, and in it there's a chapter called the Global Perspective, which talks about kind of how and when do we decide. Well, it talks about refugees in a global context. The problem is the universal rights and things. But in it, there's a principle that talks about how and when do we decide about borders. And I think it's a really interesting phrase that kind of it's a uniquely Catholic perspective and probably uniquely faith perspective to think about borders in the sense of everyone, we need to live in a borderless world, but only when there is restraint on home communities that you then put it up, which is the opposite way of looking at policy within the EU. Now we've got really tight, strength borders on the south and everywhere, to be honest, and as well as on this kind of island nation. And it's one of the principles. And I don't know whether Liam or Hans can kind of touch on that in that sense, that maybe that's where the role of faith communities is to kind of think about borders in a slightly different way, and to think about nationality in a slightly different way, as Liam mentioned about kind of the putting Pope Francis' message about putting the human person back at that centre of what we do, that being any human person, not just ones that we decide that we like.
Thank you. Would people like to respond? Would Liam or Hans like to respond to
that? I'd completely concur with that. What you finished on there, Jake. That actually the challenge is to put the person back at the centre. Obviously, across the world around, a fact that's often forgotten when our politicians are talking about refugees seeking sanctuary here, around 80% of refugees are seeking sanctuary in countries bordering near to their own. So actually, in that sense, it's not surprising that so many refugees from Ukraine are seeking sanctuary in Europe. But at the same time, that point that Pope Francis makes around the fact that Europe needs to see itself in the wider neighbourhood as well. Actually, it's not just Europe. Actually, the Mediterranean's on the intersection of three continents. So actually, the reasons why people should be seeking sanctuary here, but also our responsibility to look out to those countries in other parts of the world that are supporting many times more refugees, both as a proportion of their population and as an absolute number, and to play our part in responsibility to that. And really, coming back to what you said there, Drake, is putting the person back at the centre. Something we try to do at the Jesuit Refugee Service is see each person as an individual. Everyone's that line from Pope Francis that they've got a name, a face, and a story. This isn't about numbers or specific types of status, but actually trying to work to see the humanity of people.
Thank you. Hans.
Yeah. So I guess I like the idea of putting the human back at the center of this, but I can't help but then also link that to the question around race and racism, because one of the one of the things which runs through studies around racism and the history of racism is around precisely this. One of the sort of consequences of racism is this tendency to see some people as being more human than others, right? And therefore more deserving of empathy, but also that racism prevents us being able to empathize with certain people because we see them as being less human and therefore less like us, right? So I guess I do agree with this. The overall thrust of what you've been saying, Liam, I completely agree with. I too want a more generous, humane approach to refugees, whether it's in Britain or in the EU. But that's a difficult. I fully accept that managing migration policy in general and refugee policy specifically is a very difficult policy problem, right, with multiple dimensions. And it's very difficult to get that right. I want to draw though attention to within that difficult policy problem, this question around the differential way in which we treat different human beings, because I think that's a particular problem. It's one thing to say Britain or any other country isn't generous enough towards refugees. We don't accept, we should accept more refugees. We have the capacity to. Those are all legitimate points. And I would criticize any government from that perspective too. But it does seem to me there's something which is sort of worse than just not having a generous refugee policy in general, which is precisely this racialization of refugee policy. And this is the point that I was trying to sort of draw attention to, Liam, was to sort of say, well, look, this is difficult for everybody, but is there not something, which it does strike me, and I fully accept that as a Brit, maybe I'm biased here, and a Eurosceptic one at that, but that it does seem to me that this racialization of refugee policy is less bad in Britain than it is in a lot of the rest of the EU. And so, for example, you said, you said quite rightly, Liam, that, we have these very limited schemes for accepting refugees, right? So we had a special scheme for Ukrainians. And the UK has been criticised by other European countries by not being, for not being generous enough towards Ukrainians, because we didn't have as generous a scheme as, say, the EU has had towards Ukrainians. But as I say, I think there's something positive about that, which is that it's not racialized in quite the same way, right? So the contrast that, between Ukrainians on the one hand and Syrians and Afghans, let alone sub-Saharan Africans in the EU case, it seems to me is not quite there in the British case in the same way. We might be, it might be that you can criticize Britain for not being generous enough in general, but that discrepancy doesn't seem to me to exist in quite the same way. So you have the Ukraine scheme, but then you also have, say, the Hong Kong scheme, right? And so I just think, my impression, to put it simply, is that, whatever criticisms you might make of British refugee policy, it just doesn't differentiate between white people and Christian people on the one hand and non-white people and non-Christian people in quite the same way that EU policy does. And that's my criticism of the EU policy.
Thank you. We need to bring things to a close now. I'd like to thank Hans and Liam very much for leading our discussions this afternoon, and we'd like to thank you in the usual way. Our next Faith in Europe briefing is on a Tuesday rather than a Thursday, Tuesday the 5th of March, and the topic, which is not unrelated to what we've been talking about this afternoon, is decolonizing Christianity in Europe, learning the lessons from Black theology, with Professor Anthony Reddy. So I hope very much that you'll be able to join us for that session. Thank you all very much. Thank you to Rebecca, for colleagues at CTBI for putting this together, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks very much, and God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.